Chuck Smythe came across a document recently. It's really amazing how our people move around. As Esther mentioned, Chief Johnson was leader of the Kanekhadi clan, close relatives of the Kanektedi clan, who have clan houses right across the street from the A&S Hall. The Whale House was right across there, and the Valley House. The document was from 1910, and it was on the ownership of the Raven House that the Kwaan allowed the Kanekhadi Chief Johnson to construct in the Juneau Indian Village. So the Kanekhadi also, their territory was Taku too, and they had a Raven clan house right in the Juneau Indian Village. Workshop by Chuck Smythe will be at the Sheldon Museum, which is right across from the A&B Hall. That's this afternoon from 1:30 to 3:30. The afternoon panel, I would like to call on Amy Marvin, Matthew Fred, Lydia George, Walter Soboleff, and Anna Katzik, if they could be our panel members this afternoon. The students will defer to the experts today for the 1:30 to 4:30. Those two workshops, the first two that are listed, will be consolidated into one that will be conducted right here. The one on Tlingit personal and place names, and the one on the list of Tlingit tribes, clans, and clan houses. Our final presentation this morning will be Tom Thornton, Developing Resource Atlases. Tom, introduce yourself to our conference participants, please.
A lot of people who are engaged in research, academic research, have been before the conference, I think, talking about work that they've actually done and completed. But I'm actually here to talk about a project which I really haven't done much work on at all, but I would like to see done. And the reason why I want to talk about it is because it's something that I couldn't possibly do myself, and I don't think that any individual could. But yet I think it's something that could be done collectively by the Tlingit communities, and I think it's something that should be done and would be a very useful document to produce, and that is a Tlingit Resource Atlas. And that's a very general term, and I want to unpack it a little bit. In my original presentation, I was going to try to sell the idea a little bit, and I don't know how much time I'll have for that, but I was going to sort of give you my conception of what it is, say why I think it's worth doing, and then talk a little bit about how it might be done. And I think I will skip over most of what I was going to say at the philosophical level, except for perhaps a couple of points. Before I begin, I should introduce myself. I am a resource specialist, hence my interest in resources, with the Department of Fish and Game Division of Subsistence, and I'm also an anthropologist in training, PhD student at the University of Washington, where my main interests have been in the study of ethnogeography, particularly in the use of place names among native peoples of North America. And I will say a bit more about place names later on, and I understand that that topic has been a major focus of this gathering. And I guess before I go any further, I should say also that I'm speaking on my own behalf today and not representing the Department of Fish and Game. The notion of producing a Tlingit Resource Atlas is born, in my mind, somewhat out of frustration. Frustration that few, if any, good comprehensive guides to the native history, occupancy, and use of Southeast Alaska, or other areas for that matter, exist. Frustration that the concept of a resource is often defined very narrowly in the public policy arena. Frustration that the documentary sources which should exist and which would improve the scope and minimize the impacts of planning do not exist and often have to hastily be compiled. and too briefly summarized by researchers or agency personnel from outside of the communities that are being affected. And frustration that the process by which natural and cultural landscapes are now being managed and transformed is too centralized and removed from the places and the people that are affected. And I'm sure a lot of you have shared some of these frustrations. They tend to manifest themselves in the course of public hearings on issues like timber sales and land use plans and so forth. And they often result in some heated debates. And I don't mean to suggest that a resource atlas would soothe all of these frustrations. Of course, it wouldn't. And if it would, maybe somebody would have done it a long time ago. But I think it might help. And there are several ways I think it might help. And the first is by refocusing the debate a little bit about the environment. And when I say refocusing the debate, I mean at a very basic philosophical level. When I think about a culturally based resource atlas, I'm thinking about a document which would challenge the dominant assumptions not only about what resources the environment contains, but what the landscape itself means. A document that would turn on its head the conventional one-dimensional or purely physical. And the first one is this idea of a landscape. A lot of people, when they think of landscapes, they think of gardening or something like that. But when I talk about a landscape, I'm really talking about the environment, but an environment from the human perspective. And an environment that really has three dimensions. And the first one is the one I mentioned, the tangible or physical features of the environment. And by those things, we mean the rocks, the trees, the mountains, the rivers, the things you can touch, the things you can feel. And this is often the business of atlases, is to look at these things. You see atlases that show the mineral resources of Southeast Alaska, the various vegetation in Southeast Alaska, and so forth. The second dimension has to do with the measurable activities of men and women, such as the harvest of salmon or the harvest of timber. And sometimes these kinds of activities are represented in an atlas, but unfortunately not very often. Often atlases are confined just to that first level, the physical level. And then the third level of this idea of landscape involves the meanings and symbols which are imposed on the environment by human consciousness. And it's this element, the symbolic meaning, that enlivens the landscape and gives it its emotive and spiritual power and characterizes its representation in art and other spheres of human life. And it's really not usually the business of atlases to deal with this third dimension. In fact, maybe if you think about it, you wonder how you would do it. But I think it is possible, and I want to come back to that later on. But also, I think that to ignore the symbolic is really to rule out the possibility of linking landscape to beliefs, identities, and values. In short, to life itself. And my frustration is I've seen this dimension missing in a lot of the public planning that we do. And part of the reason is that nobody's ever tried to incorporate all three of these dimensions into a satisfying kind of publication, to my mind. The other thing I wanted to emphasize is the concept of in-habitation, which I think is very important. It seems to me that in modern times, never mind history, a lack of understanding on the part of the dominant culture, be it big business or be it national environmental organizations, to the concept of inhabitation, and that is the people's living in an environment, being part of an environment, identifying themselves with that environment, seeing it as part of them, and them as part of it, as one, as it were. The lack of an understanding and a sensitivity to that has severely hurt Native people's interests, but I also think it has served to impoverish the dominant view of what a landscape is. And I could say more about this concept of inhabitation, but I want to go on now to some more concrete and less philosophical issues. Some other reasons why I think, in addition to the philosophical, some other reasons why I think an atlas should be done is that there are genuine gaps in the literature. Okay? Much of the published anthropological literature and the scholarly literature is not really concerned with people's interactions with the landscape. Believe it or not, it's actually possible to write a paper about halibut hooks without really even talking much about halibut fishing or where to go halibut fishing. It's possible to write a paper on totem poles and really not even mention territory. And you might find that kind of odd, but there's actually a place in the academic community for doing that. But such resources aren't very helpful in the public planning process often, except that they do show that there is magnificent symbolism in these things, and it's very interesting. On the other side of the coin, there's quite a bit of technical literature, which I myself am involved in, and for example, the Department of Fish and Game, we are constantly mapping and studying people's relationships to the landscape as a part of our research and as a part of our mission. But unfortunately, our mission is somewhat constrained by the fact that we are the Department of Fish and Game, and therefore we need to preoccupy ourselves by definition with fish and game resources, which is, of course, only part of the picture. But a Tlingit Resource Atlas would not have to do this, especially if it was locally researched, locally generated. And I think it would fill some genuine gaps in the literature. And I also think it would be a powerful educational tool to natives and to non-natives alike. I'm skipping ahead here. I want to move on and talk a little bit about how we might build a resource atlas. It's interesting that the term atlas, which comes from Greek mythology, we all remember the man holding up the world, can refer to a book with a lot of maps in it, but it can also refer to anyone who's bearing a great burden. And I think that putting together a Tlingit Resource Atlas, including all of the various Kwaans and clans and their territories, would be a great undertaking, and we would need to recruit many atlases in order to complete it. And what I'm envisioning would be some kind of a process which would be seated at the local level, in which groups would decide, and when I say groups, I'm using that term deliberately vaguely because I don't want to say how this should be done, but just to make some suggestions. But for example, a village heritage corporation or a village heritage foundation might form a committee to decide how would we want to represent the resources that are in our area. How would we show it? How would we show our relationship to the landscape? And certainly, probably any group that sat down to do this would do a couple of things. I think first they would bring together some of the existing information that's already out there, but maybe not very accessible. A lot of this information that gets gathered becomes what we call gray literature. It's not published, it's not high profile, but it has been done. And somebody mentioned earlier the Goldschmidt and Hass report, and I think this is a good example of existing information that is perhaps underutilized, in part because the report was never published. But it was a regional study that was undertaken, and the mission was to determine what lands the natives of Southeast Alaska have in their possession, which they similarly possessed or claimed in 1884. And the procedure that they followed was quite simple and straightforward. They went to every community, almost every community in Southeast, and they held a meeting, and they said, who here can tell us about the history of occupancy and use of the various lands in this area, and then who can tell us about who's using them today and what they're doing? And the people gathered, they met, they decided what representatives would speak for their community, and it's often at least one representative from each clan, of course, but also a balance of older people and younger people. And then they held interviews. And the documentary that came out of it, the documentary evidence of relationships with the landscape, is remarkable because you have a series of testimony from people about their relationships to various parts of Southeast Alaska, and also what they did in those areas, not only in 1946 when the study was done, but 100 years earlier, 50 years earlier. And a lot of the change in the relationship to the landscape is documented there. I might point out in talking about Goldschmidt and Hass that there is, like I say, a lot of testimony there, but the mapping is in fact not very good. They did produce several maps, but the quality is really not very good, and I think they're difficult to use. And they also did not map all of the information that they gathered. There's really a lot more information there than what gets put on the map. But they did cite things like burying areas, they did cite things like hunting areas and fishing areas and villages and so forth. So that's one example of an existing source. Another very interesting one, which I'll just mention, is a map that was done right here in the Chilkat area by George Davidson, who was a very famous geographer from University of California. And he came up here in the 1860s when the United States was just laying out, just taking over control of the territory, and they wanted to map the area between here and the Yukon River, because not much was known about it from Western circles. So he got a hold of a chief by the name of Kohklux, right here in Chilkat, a very prominent, he referred to him as a chief, a very prominent leader here in Chilkat. And he said, "We really don't know anything about the territory in here. Can you represent it for us?" And he tells the story in an article he wrote, and it's very amusing actually, but the Chilkat leader went, retired with two of his wives and several huge pieces of paper and a pencil, and he remarks that there were no erasers. And he went back and he drew exactly which routes the people took into the interior up to the Yukon River. And in the course of doing this, a large number of place names obviously came out, places that served as markers for them along the way, but also a lot of stories came out about events that had occurred in that landscape. And it was a very important interaction in that it helped get that area mapped for the first time on Western maps. But it was also, I think, a very poignant cross-cultural encounter. And the fact was that Kohklux could represent the landscape quite well, even on paper and pad, which was certainly not what he was used to doing. In fact, George Davidson remarks that when they were done, he took the pencil away from Kohklux and he asked him to name these places, and then they wrote them down. And then after they wrote them down, he read them back to the Chilkat leader, and he was most impressed that they could remember them by scrawling these things on the paper, and he wanted them to teach him how to do that. And so the beginning of reading and writing in the Chilkat area, perhaps. But anyway, that's another example of, I think, a very fine resource. Probably very few people know about it. But that's stuff that already exists, and there's lots of that. But very little of it is in mapped form. A lot of it's in documentary form, testimonial form, and so forth. Then there's the process of reviewing and expanding information that exists. And this is something that I think we don't do enough of. When we carry out a research project, we don't put it back to the community for local review. We do a lot of studies in Department of Fish and Game, and often we're, because of the resources necessary to conduct a survey, you're limited in how many people you can talk to in order to physically complete it. And so you rely on a sample. But it's possible, if you want to be comprehensive, to do that sample, but then send it back to the community for a check to see if, in fact, you did represent all of the important fishing areas or hunting areas. And we have tried to do that in our research, but I don't know if that's always been the process. I don't think so. And then the third thing would be to actually solicit new information. Okay, you would be deciding what kinds of products do not exist. For example, I've heard a number of people refer to maps of villages, maybe in the 19th century. I've seen a number of sketches of various villages. Jeff Lear was talking about the Waterman document. There are several sketches, in addition to the place names, there are several sketches of villages and the relationships of the clan houses to each other. But they are buried in the archives. And wouldn't it be nice to get them all out and to review them and to publish those maps as a collection? So new information, I think, would be an important part of it. And of course, you would have to then assemble this thing into some kind of meaningful whole. And this, of course, would take a lot of time and a lot of resources. And hopefully we can talk about how that might be done in the afternoon session, if for those of you who are able to attend. And then finally, again, I'm moving quite fast. I want to just briefly touch on some potential contents that might be in this Tlingit Resource Atlas, were it ever to be completed. And I should note here that there are some prototypes, there are some examples out there. A pretty good one is one called the Zuni Atlas, which was done in conjunction with members of the Zuni tribe, and takes a look at their territory from a number of different angles. But it seems to me any atlas has to include some or all of the following. First, the physical geography. That first dimension of landscape is obviously very important. And you have to do things like show where Tlingits are as opposed to the rest of the world. You need to locate them in Alaska and then in Southeast Alaska. And you need to show something about Southeast Alaska. So maps about geology and showing some of the ecology are necessary, and those are quite common in atlases, of course. A second thing which I think is basic is showing something about the ethnogeography. And what is ethnogeography? Well, ethno just means people. So when we say that, we're saying the people's geography, and that would be Tlingit geography. And here I think you could do some interesting things with maps in terms of representing Tlingit geography. One would be to introduce the Kwaan as a geographic concept. It is a geographic concept, and it was recognized by Tlingits, but I wonder how many people in Southeast Alaska are even aware of the fact that there were 12 or 13 Kwaans in this area and where their borders were, or how their borders changed. But you could represent this, and I think it would be a powerful teaching tool. Goldschmidt and Hass, in fact, did this in a general sense in their work. Yes. Is that where I'm stationed?
Down by the ballpark. There's a road that goes right by the Eagle Center.
A second thing is, in addition to the Kwaan, is place names. And I think Jeff Lear said something about the Waterman document, which is really an incredible piece of work. I mean, he documented some 900 Tlingit place names just around mostly around the Ketchikan area. And it's just extraordinary to me. I have kind of an abiding interest in this. It's extraordinary to me the density at which you find these names. You know, where there is a single English name for a bay, there might be 2 dozen, 3 dozen, maybe more Tlingit names. And of course, the Tlingit names are infinitely more descriptive than the English names. They talk about the geology of the landscape. They talk about the biology, the hydrology, the history, and obviously some of the important events that have occurred there. I ran across somebody mentioned Kadashan. I ran across an interesting statement that he made, or reportedly made, to Governor Brady in 1898. He said, ever since I was a boy, I've heard the names of different points and bays and islands and mountains in this area, places where the Tlingit get herring, where they hunt and make camps. And after that, he said, and that's why I think this country belongs to us, because we know the names. And we know, I think all of the work that you've done this week on names, both place names and personal names, just underscores how important naming was in Tlingit culture. But do you ever get that sense reading a published book about Southeast Alaska? No. In fact, I read a publication about Glacier Bay not too long ago that said there weren't any native names in Glacier Bay except Lituya Bay. That was the only one left. And it just so happened that Bob Schroeder and I didn't believe that, and we went over and we did some interviewing, and we did a sketch map, which I think he introduced in one of the sessions, that had at least 75 Tlingit names right within Glacier Bay proper, the park itself. So anyway, ethnogeography is very important. A third thing is what we sometimes call cosmology or cosmography, and that is the personal feelings that people have towards the universe, not just the landscape, but the whole universe. And you might wonder, why is it important to represent this? And I would say that it's important to represent how you believe the universe was formed and how the universe operates, because how you see the world influences how you act on the world. And since time immemorial, all human societies have pondered and attempted to reflect on the attempted to reflect on the nature of the cosmos and to come to terms with the nature of the universe. And their motive is always more than just plain curiosity. It reflects a deep-rooted need to have a stable and consistent basis into which to fit information about the known world and to theorize what unknown portions of it might be like. And Jeff mentioned Thomas Waterman, and Thomas Waterman was really Mr. Place Names. He worked not only in Southeast Alaska, but all over California. And one of the things he did was to try to represent the UofC, which is a Northern California group, tried to represent their notion of the cosmos and how it operated on paper. And it's quite interesting. He came up with a disk with 4 directions and various elements to it, but it basically was a disk floating on an ocean. And it's quite an interesting diagram if you ever get a chance to see it. But how would you represent the Tlingit cosmos from a traditional point of view? I think, obviously, when I think about how to do this, I immediately think of the raven stories that I've heard, the whole cycle of tales. And these tales are very much concerned with how the universe came into existence and how it operates and why it does. And yet, so often the stories are told just in a general fashion. But in fact, in many cases, they're linked to specific landscapes within territories. And you could map this. You could have a map that showed places that Raven created in Southeast Alaska. And I think it would be a very powerful representation. It would stun a lot of people and very much get them interested. Hey, how are these people looking at the universe? Are we looking at it the same way? And then you could go on from there. For example, you could do a geography of the flood. There's numerous mentions of the Great Flood in mythology and texts. And again, we talk about specific mountains where people took refuge. And you could show this. Migration patterns of clans. This is something that really lends itself to a visual representation. And when I say this, I mean you might show it on a map, but of course you would have extensive commentary on the sidelines that would accompany it. And there are other things pertaining to history and culture. An obvious thing one thing that is done now is to locate the major archaeological sites, the material remains. And I think there's a good reason for keeping some of this information secret and not publishing it, but I think in other cases it makes sense to show where the major sites are. Fort sites, how many place names in Tlingit land end with the suffix nu, fort. In many cases, these refer to actual defensive positions that people retreated to in times of war. So you can go on and on. A third dimension, in addition to what I call basic geography and history and culture, a third dimension would be economy. I think it's very important to show how people made a living, and I think that you can do this very effectively with mapping. And you can show where people fished, you can show where people hunted, you can show where people gathered. And again, a lot of our research at the Division of Subsistence has to do with these things. But you can also show things like where did people work when canneries came into Southeast Alaska? Which villages sent labor to which canneries? Or which fishing grounds did people begin to go to in which decades? And so forth and so on. But anyway, these are just some of the ideas that I think might be relevant to a resource atlas and might be included. So I want to emphasize that it wouldn't just be traditional culture, but also modern, contemporary practices as well. So I'll just conclude by saying I've skimmed over things in rather hastily, and I hope I haven't lost you. And I hope that this idea I have, this sort of wish, may someday come true, and I hope that we can pursue it in some more depth this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I mentioned when I gave my opening presentation on way back, when was that? Thursday morning, centuries ago, that I've been working on a crest book for, almost 20 years or so. It's in draft form, so, I welcome all kinds of criticisms and suggestions, but I was trying to come up with a description of the land that the Tlingit tribes and clans inhabit, and it's really stumped me, because you can't say Southeast Alaska. It's a lot more than Southeast Alaska. And one of the ideas I came up with was Raven Creator Bioregion, but that's not good enough because the Athabascans claim the raven as a creator too. So you're talking about the whole universe essentially, and the Navajos are related to us too, and they're way down there. So I've been struggling with these ideas on how to map this stuff, to map the migrations, map the lands. You buy the American maps and everything drops off at the border into nothingness. It's big white space there. You buy the Canadian maps and it's the opposite. Everything on the American side is a white nothingness. It's a real challenge, and I think with people like Tom to help us, we're going to do some good things. There's lunch at the A&B Hall. I think we should, break until 2 o'clock and then run the workshops 2 to 5. And again, I'd like to call upon our panel of experts to participate this afternoon. We're combining the personal and place names with the Tlingit tribe and clan name workshops. It'll be right here. Amy Marvin, Matthew Fred, Lydia George, Walter Sobolev, Anna Katzik, and we're going to ask if Austin can participate in both the Raven House and this workshop this afternoon too. So, see you at 2 for the ones that are going to be back here.